early history of Vermont, water power was very important to the settlers. There was no electricity, no internal combustion engines, not even any steam engines. So water power was an important thing for the settlers. And so you'll notice a lot of communities in Vermont grew up around that water power, and that was certainly true here in Jericho. Jericho is actually blessed with 3 streams that provided water power. The Mill Brook in the southern part of the town had 3 mills. Lee River in the center part of the town had 2 mill sites. But the best water power was on the Browns River in the northern part of Vermont, or northern part of Jericho. And within a stretch of just over a mile, the river drops 132 feet. And so this provided 7 different, what they're called mill privileges, sites that were appropriate to build a mill on. We're going to tell you a brief history of all of these mill sites, but most importantly, we're going to talk about the mill privilege number 2 on the Browns River, where the Chittenden Mills roller mill is located. My name is Gary Irish, and I was for many years a director of the Jericho Historical Society from the time when they acquired the mill through many of the renovations that were done on the building. There were 3 mills on Mill Brook and 2 on Lee River. These supported sawmills, shingle mills, a grist mill, a starch factory, a clothier's shop, a rake factory, a woolen mill, and a woodenware factory. This photo shows the woodenware factory on Mill Brook in the Muttonville section of town, which was operated by Truman and Augustus Wood. This may be the woolen mill that was located on Lee River, but we are not certain. While owned by E.W. Curtis, this sawmill was washed away in a flood in 1903. Note the covered bridge in the right of the photo and parts of Chittenden Mills in the background. There is no known photo of the granite sheds. This photo from 1989 shows the area with the remains of the concrete dam and the penstock leading to the Leffel turbine that was powered the air compressors used to work the granite. This site had about a 14-foot head of water, the vertical distance the water drops to provide the power. This is one of the company's envelopes, showing what is perhaps their most well-known work, the Civil War statue of Reverend John H. Woodward, located on the Green in Westford. This is a recent photo of this monument. Another local monument made here is the one commemorating the Brown family, first settlers of Jericho, which was erected as part of the celebration of the 150th anniversary of the chartering of the town in 1913. This is currently located near the Browns River Middle School. After the Jericho Granite Company closed in the 1930s, the site was taken over by a man named Crosset Shawneau, who used some of the granite shed buildings and the water power to run a small woodworking business. And these photos are some examples of some of the wooden items that were made in this mill. On the east side of the river at this site were 3 buildings. The upper building was for manufacturing woolen cloth, built by Matthew Barney before 1804, and was powered by the dam above the bridge. This was later used as a tin shop by Joseph Bissonette. The middle building was for carding wool, built by Truman Barney before 1820, and the lower building was also built by Truman Barney and was used for cloth dressing. By the 1850s, the middle building was used for carding and as a cider mill, finally being taken down about 1900. The lower building was used as a sash and blind factory by Henry and George Shedd and was taken down about 1900 as well. This depiction of these buildings is a painting done by Washington Roscoe, who for many years operated a business on Pump Road where he made picture frames and small wooden items. In 1877, Henry Field and Simon Bullock began their business of manufacturing chairs, and for 6 years did a flourishing business, selling chairs as far away as South America. They employed about 35 men. The chair seat frames were framed out to local women and children, who wove cane seats in them and then returned them to the factory to complete assembly. These chairs are noted for the legs sitting upon the caning and also for their flat, curved front stretcher. After 1883, the mill was used for making small wooden items by several people until it was destroyed by fire in 1925. Mill Privilege Number 5 on Pump Road was the site of a factory used to make wooden water pumps and wooden water pipes. It was originally built by Simon Davis about 1840 and was the only business of its kind in Vermont. At first, boring was done by hand with a paw auger, but soon machinery was installed for turning and boring. Greatly enlarged by he and his son-in-law Henry Field about 1856, and more new machinery added by Henry and Anson Field about 1863. Several thousand pumps and many miles of tubing were produced each year. This factory supplied a large territory in New England and eastern New York with wooden pumps and pipe until about 1900, when iron pumps took over the market. Mill Privilege Number 6, also on Pump Road, had a sawmill built there before 1840. Besides general lumber production, the mill at times provided the material for the pump factory. About 1872, Henry Field built a plant on the south side of the river to pump river water to a tank in the top of a tower he had built, and the water from there was conveyed to houses in the village. This photo shows the water tower looking from Pump Road, with the school, now the Jericho Town Hall, the Methodist Church, and the spire of the Congregational Church, seen in the right background. This photo is a close-up of the water tower. Mill Privilege Number 7 on Silly Hill Road had a sawmill on the south side of the river prior to 1819. This mill was purchased by Benijah Buxton in 1837, and he operated it until 1873, when it was sold, and a gristmill added on the site. Rake handles and shingles were also produced here. This painting by Charles Lewis Heide shows this mill, probably in the 1850s. There was at one time also an oil mill on this site, where flaxseed were pressed to make linseed oil. In 1876, Whitcomb and Day built a box factory on the site, where for about 20 years they manufactured up to 15,000 cheese boxes per year for the use of their cheese factory in Riverside. This is E.B. Williams, a prominent local businessman. In 1910, Mr. Williams built a sawmill on the north side of the river. This is a receipt from that time. That mill burned in 1928, and the present building was built to replace it. The mill ceased operation about 1961, and the building was converted into a home. We're now back at Mill Privilege Number 2 on the Browns River. This was undoubtedly the best water power on the whole river. The early history of it is a little unclear. One of the problems being, of course, not much information was recorded, but another problem, a lot of what was recorded was the land records in the town clerk's office. And unfortunately, in that time period, the town clerk had extremely poor handwriting, so it's very difficult to read the records. From what we do know, by at least 1815, a man named John Bliss had built a grist mill on the site. By about 1820, it was being operated by Truman Barney. By the early 1840s, it had been converted to a starch mill by Matthew Barney. The starch mill was where they would take potatoes and make them into starch. In the early 1850s, it was used as a cabinet maker's shop by Anson Field, and did an extensive furniture business. Then in 1857, James Harvey Hutchinson, who was from Jericho but had gone to California during the California Gold Rush, had made his money there not by finding gold but by selling cattle and mules to the prospectors. And he returned to Jericho and in 1857 built a new grist mill here. Parts of the mill that you see here today, the stonework pretty much, is from that 1857 mill. It had 4 runs of stones and was powered by turbines, not a water wheel. It employed 5 men. In the early 1860s, this mill was owned by Clark Wilbur and Hira Percival. Clark Wilbur sold his share of the mill and moved to Minneapolis, where he worked in the Washburn and Crosby's A Mill, the largest flour mill in the world at the time. Sadly, he was one of the 18 men killed when it exploded May 2, 1878. In the late 1860s, the mill was purchased by Ferdinand Beach and Lucian Howe, and in 1871 Mr. Howe became the sole owner. Lucian Howe was one of the local businessmen who promoted the building of the Burlington and Lamoille Railroad through Jericho, and once it began operation in 1877, he shipped large quantities of grain in from the Midwest to grind in his mill, along with locally grown grain. In the early 1880s, he went into partnership with his son Frank, and in early 1885 they decided to expand their business even further, traveling to Columbus, Ohio to contract with the Case Manufacturing Company to provide millwright work for the mill. The mill shut down in June of 1885, and the front wall was taken down, with the building being expanded closer to the road. The Howes hired Mr. A.C. Chick of Melrose Highlands, Massachusetts, to do blasting to increase the head of water and thus the power available to run the new mill. Mr. Chick started blasting at the water level of Curtis's mill pond. He used dynamite, a new and novel thing at the time, when many townspeople turned out to see the work. He blasted a channel 8 feet wide and continued upstream to the wheelhouse, going progressively lower in the height of the ledge as the height of the ledge increased. By mid-June, the wheelhouse was being gutted in preparation for the blasting. He not only lowered the tail race, but blasted inside the walls of the wheelhouse, taking the ledge down 6.5 feet at the front and 8 feet at the rear of the wheelhouse, and despite the predictions of local residents, did so without damaging the walls of the wheelhouse. This increased the head of water to 27 feet and powered 4 Tyler turbines, which, along with 20 tons of shafting and gears, were furnished by Edward Stevens and Company of Winooski. Mr. Chick also blasted ledge in the mill basement to both prepare the foundation of the mill extension and to give room for machinery. Meanwhile, by mid-June, the Sinclair brothers were busy starting the work on expanding the mill. The upper floors were entirely new, with the walls being 2x6 plank laid flat one upon another. By mid-August, the elevator tower was nearing completion, and the exterior above the stone walls was being covered with the Montross metal shingles that Mr. Howe had purchased from E. Van Norden and Company in Boston. In September, the storehouse had been moved and attached to the rear of the main mill building. As the building structure was completed, the new machinery was being installed. This picture of the mill was probably taken in 1886. A platform scale just visible in the right of this picture was in the front yard, used to weigh wagons with grain coming into the mill. You can also see in the left background some of the buildings that were along the back of the mill yard. Also notice that the rear portion of the mill building is flush with the front part. The cost of the renovations is unknown, except for the blasting and foundation work, which cost the Howes about $7,000. That would be just over $200,000 in today's money. So this leads to speculation that the entire renovation in today's funds must have cost at least $750,000, if not even more. The new mill was back in operation in January 1886. It was named Chittenden Mills in honor of Thomas Chittenden, first governor of Vermont and the great-great-grandfather of Frank Howe. As can be seen from these billheads, the name Chittenden Mills was sometimes used, but other times it was just L.B. and F. Howe. And sometimes a depiction of the mill building was used, at other times a depiction of one of the new roller mills was used. George Clerkin was the head miller for the Howes. He is shown on the left in this picture with his son, who ran the blacksmith shop directly across the road from the mill, who's on the right. And on this receipt, he is signed for the Howes. Business continued to boom. One newspaper article in November 1886 stated, "The Chittenden roller mills ran night and day last week, from Monday noon until Saturday night at 12 o'clock, turning out patent flour. They make an average of 50 barrels a day." Flour was packed in both barrels and bags two of which are depicted in these photos. One mystery for which no information has been found is who supplied their flour barrels, as there was no record of any local barrel makers. This is a picture of George Miller, who worked at the mill for every owner from Lucian Howe until George White. Frank Howe continued operation of the mill after his father's death in 1899. Note the signboard on the front of the mill over the basement door listing prices for the various mill products. And although it is hard to see, there is a small walkway below the sign to allow access to update it as needed. At that time, the steps onto the front porch were on the right end, allowing clear access to the front for wagons to load. Also note the finial on top of the elevator tower. More on that later. This is a picture of one of Frank Howe's flour bags. Flour production continued until the death of Mr. Clerkin in 1904, when it ceased and the rolls were sold. From then on, the mill produced only animal feed and oxidant flour from the Russell Miller Milling Company in Minnesota. The first all-purpose flour was shipped in for resale. The mill was sold to Moses Whitcomb in 1904. In 1906, it was sold to Charles Ravey. Mr. Ravey had some advertising items made that he passed out to customers, such as this match holder. The mill was sold to Carmen Brush and his son Morris in 1919. Like Mr. Ravey, the Brushes had various items made to keep their name in front of potential customers, such as this hot dish mat and calendar. In 1937, the mill was purchased by the E.W. Bailey Company of Montpelier. It was one of several local mills that they purchased to eliminate competition. Others included the Waterbury Feed Company and the Underhill Mill. These are two receipts from that time period. This mill finally ceased operation in 1946. With repairs undergoing on the retaining wall in front of the mill right now, the view here is kind of obscured, but the platform on the front of the mill is pretty much as it would have been back in operating days, except for these steps on the front. Those originally were over on the right-hand end, and that allowed the front of it to be all clear so wagons could back up there for loading. There were 3 windows into the basement on this side of the building. They've been closed up so as to prevent water from running into the basement, but you can notice on the stonework here, the lintels that would have been over this front window. There was one a little further back, and then back, we'll see in just a moment, there was one that was even bigger. It had actually a window well, and that allowed some amount of light into the basement. On the side of the mill, under this door, roof over this doorway, there was actually a small platform here where loading and unloading could take place as well. That has long since been removed, and the platform you see here now is a current addition by the Historical Society for their ice cream shop. This small doorway in the side of the mill here, built into the stonework, at first glance doesn't really look like much, but it actually was a key part of the whole mill operation, because this is where, when grain was brought to the mill, it was all dumped through this small doorway into the bottom of the main elevator, then taken up in that elevator to the top of the elevator tower and distributed through different parts of the mill to whatever function it needed to go to. And so this was the beginning of everything that happened here. The property was then purchased by George White and his son Floyd. They started the Chittenden Mills service station and used part of that mill for automobile repairs. The property was purchased by Alonzo Skip Bennett in 1954, and the business was operated by he and Harold Rose. The mill was purchased by the town of Jericho in 1973, and ownership was transferred to the Jericho Historical Society to maintain and restore. In this photo, we see the back of the mill with some of the mill pond. This is in the mid-1940s, as the extension on the side of the mill building looks to be newly added. This allowed more room when the building was used for automobile repair work. When the mill stopped being used as a mill, this back part was converted to use for automobile repair when the filling station was built out beside the road. And to enlarge their area for that, this little addition that you see on the side of the mill, just on the first floor that sticks out maybe 4 or 5 feet, was added on to give them a little additional room for the automobile repair. Another change made at this time was that the side door on the main building was enlarged for vehicle access, as seen in this 1972 view. The middle room was used in the winter for vehicle storage and also was used for painting cars. When they were using it for car painting, a tarp was hung from the ceiling so that grain dust would not sprinkle down onto the new freshly coated paint. After the mill was acquired by the Historical Society, the side door was restored to its original size and configuration. Fortunately, the original doors had been saved when the opening was enlarged, so they were reinstalled. This picture dates from 1997, when the windows had been taken out for repairs. This panoramic view of the village shows the mill pond, and also on the right some of the other buildings that once lined the back of the mill yard. This is another view of those buildings. There were several buildings along the back edge of the present parking lot where animals were kept and such things as hay and ice were stored. This is the one remaining barn as it looked in 1988. At that time, it had two large garage doors on the front. It had been used at various times as a stable for horses and as a garage for the Jericho town truck. This shows the barn as the garage doors openings were being closed up and windows and new siding installed in 1989. This is the way the barn appears today. The mill house, built in 1859, was the home for each successive owner and operator of the mill through the years. It is in the Gothic Revival style. The first photo dates from the early 1900s and the second is from 1976. The house did not at first have a front porch. It was a late 1800s addition. This small barn up behind the house probably was used to keep the carriages and horses and so forth for the family, as whoever lived in the house. At one time, the back wall, the side that we're looking at on the right of this picture, had a lean-to built onto it that we believe was used as a hen house. Even though the mill had a lot of customers, a lot of traffic going by all the time, the house was really just a private residence. And so they had this little sign engraved in the ledge to let folks know that. Due to the natural ledge on the east bank of the river, the mill dam was only about 20 feet long, although a low spot in the ledge required a small accessory dam where water overflowed in times of high water. As seen in this photo, this, like the main dam, was initially a timber dam, but this one was later replaced by the existing concrete dam. These photos show this area during times of high water, the first also showing the underside of the covered bridge. During normal water flow, no water came over this small dam. This shows the main dam and the channel during high water. This small concrete dam was put in to replace the original timber frame dam that was in this location. Normally, the water just came over the large dam over beside the Wheelhouse, but in times of high water, the water flooded enough so that it would come over on this side of the so-called island in the middle, and so they had to block this off in some fashion. So this wasn't really used very often, but was there in case of high water. Some rocks had become dislodged and slid into the tail race, blocking the water flow and causing water to back up into the Wheelhouse. So in June 1974, the Vermont National Guard came to the mill and, as a training exercise, removed some of the rocks to unblock the river channel. As can be seen, this activity drew a crowd of spectators. This is the remnants of the concrete dam that was put in by the Jericho Granite Company about 1910 and powered their granite sheds. Long since been undermined and the river is no longer dammed up by it. But that is also what was referred to back in the time that they were dynamiting the river channel as Curtis's Mill Pond. This doorway is something that the Historical Society added to the mill once they acquired the building. Originally in this location there was just a window, and when you open the door, we're looking out on the area where the forebay and penstock were located that went into the wheelhouse to bring the water into the turbines. This shows the forebay where the water from the mill pond entered the wheelhouse in the 1940s. This older cement wall hooked into the forebay and was part of the mechanism to get the water into the wheelhouse. The newer concrete that you see around was a retaining wall that was put in the early 1970s to protect the back of the wheelhouse. After the dam washed out, a few years later, the back of the wheelhouse itself washed out. And so this retaining wall was put in by Skip Bennett, the owner of the mill at the time, to protect the wheelhouse from any further damage. This photo from 1972 shows where the back wall of the wheelhouse had washed out in 1971 and was replaced by poured concrete along with a retaining wall to protect the back of the wheelhouse. The state had contractors rebuilding the Route 15 bridge in front of the mill at the time, and Skip Bennett, who owned the mill, hired them to repair the rear of the wheelhouse and add a wall to protect it from future damage. These iron pins in the ledge were what anchored the dam to the ledge so it didn't get swept downriver, held it in place. These held the back part of the dam. The face of the dam was just a little bit further ahead, and you can notice down there the rocks, how they're worn. That would have been where the water was going over the dam for 150 years or so. This shows the mill dam in operational days, probably the 1930s. Also notice the Occident flower sign on the front of the mill. This and the next few photos show the slow decay of the mill dam after the water power was no longer being used and thus the dam was no longer being maintained. In this photo, we see where the plank or two on the top edge of the dam has broken and the water is coming through the opening. Also note the loss of the finial on the top of the elevator tower. In this photo, we see that the mill dam, although still standing, is no longer holding water. This photo from 1970 shows just a few of the bottom timbers from the dam left in place, although the forebay still appears to be intact. On the farther side of the river, you notice that new cement retaining wall. The top of the dam, of course the retaining wall wasn't there at the time, but the top of the dam would have been about a foot to 2 feet above the top of where that wall is today, to give you an idea of the height of it. We also see the door on the back there that we saw from the inside, where they originally had been just a window. This small door in the back of the wall of the mill, now kind of boarded up with cleats across it, originally was an access so from the inside of the mill people could get out to work on the forebay and so forth, clean dirt, sticks and so forth off the trash rack. But also they would stick a fish pole out there from time to time and catch fish in the mill pond. They said it was pretty good fishing. In 1975, a stone wall was built in front of the mill using stones from the foundation of the platform scales, and flagpoles were installed in it. This photo shows Colonel Howard Buxton speaking at the dedication on November 11th of that year. Later, it was removed due to blocking the driveway. The roof of the wheelhouse had suffered damage over the years, and in 1981, the Seabees rebuilt much of it as a training exercise. After almost 100 years, the shingle on the mill roof had deteriorated, and in 1978, the Society was able to have dies made to reproduce the distinctive pattern shingles. But it took still more time to raise the funds to install them on the very high and steep roof. The first were put on the parking lot side of the main building in 1982 by David Bilodeau. Next, the parking lot side of the rear section was replaced by John Turnbaugh in 1988. These are the dies that the Historical Society had made to stamp out the new shingles when they replaced the originals on the roof. So these are duplicates of what originally were on there, the dies having been made from one of the original shingles. Even the new shingles had to be repainted from time to time, and this photo shows that being done in the same area in 2000. Replacing the remainder of the roof was done by Harriseket Restorations of Maine, owned by Bob Fulmer, starting in 1993. As part of this work, a replica of the finial on the top of the elevator tower was created by Larry Stearns and installed by Harriseket. Unfortunately, the part first done in 1982 was done incorrectly, and that had to be removed and reinstalled. This photo shows work underway on the elevator tower in November 1993. Here we see the mill in November 1994 after the roof had been entirely replaced and both that and the metal part of the sidewalls painted. The Society decided not to repaint the stone walls of the mill red as they had originally been done, but this still brought the building back to much of what it would have looked like back in 1886. The roof has required periodic repainting to keep the metal from deteriorating. Several times over the years, the windows have needed to be removed and repaired or replaced, along with deterioration in the framing around them. This photo shows such work underway in 1997. We're now in the middle level of the wheelhouse. The wheelhouse actually has 3 levels, but the lowest level is no longer accessible due to the river channel blockage and water being backed up in here. This photo shows the lowest level in the wheelhouse in 1983. After the 1885 renovations, this was even deeper. The water came to the turbines in a wooden penstock, and by the 1940s this was in poor shape, so the owners at that time decided to encase it in concrete, and that is under the debris along the wall on the right side of this photo. Note the part of a gear showing in the lower left of this picture. This is a picture from the 1940s showing the gear seen in the last photo when it was in its original position in the wheelhouse. This changed the vertical shaft coming up from the turbine below to a horizontal shaft for a belt to then go through into the basement of the mill. From what you can see in the back of me here, there's a concrete wall back there. The penstock where the water came into the wheelhouse is under that concrete. The penstock was made out of wood, and by the 1940s this was getting a little shaky, and so to preserve it without having to totally replace it, they just encased it in concrete. So that runs down under the concrete you can see, and then under my feet down on the lower level, and then branches off to each of the 4 turbines. There originally were 4 turbines down on the lowest level. Today there are only 3 of them left. The 4th one, we don't know what happened. It's not there, whether it got encased in the concrete or whether it got removed at some point. From the turbines, the water flowed out of them and down the tail race and out through an arched opening in the front of the wheelhouse and back into the river channel. From where we are standing here, the floor level below us is probably about 6 feet lower. And then with this concrete that's poured below it, it's probably another 4 feet below that. So the ledge that was taken out in the 1885 rebuild of the mill made this about 10 feet deeper than what you see today. In this view, you can see where the timber framing fits into notches cut in the ledge. The piece sitting on top of the timbers is part of the gate stem that was used to open and close the gate valve on one of the turbines, which would start and stop the machinery. The wheelhouse roof had leaked for years, and the framing inside had rotted, so the previous owner of the mill had cut the few remaining timbers to let the machinery drop safely and not damage the stone walls. After the Historical Society acquired the mill, volunteers removed the debris from the space and replaced the framing. This picture looks from the front toward the back, showing the middle level in 1983 after the framing had been rebuilt. This is a photo also on the middle level looking from the back toward the front, and shows more of the new framing and how that framing in some cases fits into notches in the ledge. The Historical Society acquired some of the material for this framing from a barn donated to the Society by Harley Irish, with the provision that the Society dismantle and remove the barn. Also at this time, the Society was having some electrical work done in the mill by a contractor named Cedric Demerit. One day his brother Everett Demerit stopped by just to see what the project looked like, and from that the Society found that Everett operated a sawmill in North Wolcott. The Society ended up buying some timbers and several pieces to be used as new rafters to replace the broken ones in the wheelhouse roof. We're now in the upper level of the wheelhouse. The shafting from the turbines was stacked vertically and came from the lowest level where we were all the way up to the ceiling in this part of the wheelhouse, and then belts from there ran through openings in the wall, like you can see here, that's blocked off by this old sign, because the more recent use of the basement required that they have heat in there, and they needed to block off the draft coming in from the wheelhouse. All of the framing that you see in this part is all something that the Historical Society replaced back in the 1970s. The original framing had started to rot because the roof was leaking, and the owner of the mill at that time cut through the last few timbers that were still holding and let everything drop into the bottom part of the wheelhouse, just so as to prevent the shafting, which is very heavy, from falling over and damaging the stone walls. So the Historical Society cleaned all of that debris out and replaced everything you see in here.
These next three photos show the upper level of the wheelhouse, which is at the level of the mill basement. These 1981 photos show this level while the Seabees were rebuilding the wheelhouse roof, installing new rafters to replace ones which had been broken by snow and ice falling from the mill roof onto the wheelhouse roof after the supports for these rafters had been destroyed by rot.
And you'll notice the rafters are supported on this center timber because they're a 24-foot span, and this helps to support them with, so they won't break when the snow falls off the main roof of the mill. And so a bunch of the rafters had also been broken, and those had to be replaced as well, and so now they all have support under them, so they'll hold up well. Besides the shafting coming up from the turbines, the other thing that came up was called the gate stems, and this is what was pulled up and down to open and close the valves on the sides of the turbines that let the water either come in or stay out to start or stop the machinery. And so the gate stem came up and was topped with a rack and pinion gear, and then a horizontal shaft from that ran over and through basically a pump log, a wooden tube, through the stone wall to a gear that we'll see in the basement, and then ultimately up to the first floor, so the turbines could be started and stopped from the first floor.
This photo from the 1940s shows the upper level of the wheelhouse with some of the belting pulleys and gears that transferred power into the basement.
One of the interesting things to note in here is the timber that's running along the wall. That is original. That one was not one that got damaged by rot. And that is about 50 feet long and is original to the wheelhouse well, the wheelhouse itself dates from the 1857 mill, so probably that timber dates from 1857 as well. In the basement was some of the wheat cleaning machinery, and most of that was, well, the basement had a dirt floor and a lot of it rotted, and some of it had been taken apart, and the metal parts sold for scrap iron and so forth. But there's a few panels and so forth that were left, and this is one of them from the Richmond smut machine, made by the William Richmond Company in Lockport, New York, and that's what cleaned the smut from the wheat. And there's a few other panels here that we'll see in just a moment. This piece, all we know is from one of the Case Manufacturing Company pieces of equipment, but it is not at all clear even which machine it came from, and it's all that's left of that machine. Another piece of wood out of the Eureka smut and separating machine made by Howes Babcock and Company from Silver Creek, New York. Again, this is all that's left of that whole machine. This piece looks at first like just a piece of wood, but it actually is a tool that had a very specific purpose. It has this hexagonal hole in the side, one end of it, and you'll notice there is a slot cut in it with a bolt. So this hexagonal opening would fit over the shaft of a millstone, and then the bolt tightened to clamp it on. On this other end, there's a tiny hole that would have had a pencil or a marker of some sort, and this would be what you would use when you were sharpening the millstone. You could rotate this around through the whole circumference of the stone, and it would tell you that all parts of the stone were level with each other, because they had to be very perfectly cut, or else they would, wheat would be able to fall through a bigger crack where it shouldn't. These are a couple of examples of the openings that went through the foundation wall between the basement and the wheelhouse. One of them apparently was no longer needed many years ago and was actually filled up with stone. The other one was closed off more recently when the basement was being used for commercial purposes, and they wanted to keep the cold air from getting into the basement from the wheelhouse. And so that was what those openings were for. There's many of them in the wall in different places all along. Belts would have run in from those onto shafts here in the basement that we'll see in a minute. This is an example of how the shafting would have been in the basement. You notice these big heavy timbers were what were supporting it, and you'd had pulleys various sizes and shapes, and the belts from the wheelhouse would have come in through these openings in the wall we've been talking about onto the pulleys in here, and then belts would have run from that shafting on other pulleys up to, like this one, it goes up to another shaft up by the ceiling here, or in this case in particular there would have been belts going up right directly above onto the first floor to power the roller mills. This is from a setup when the basement had a museum in it a few years ago. But what this is showing is how the gate stem that we saw in the wheelhouse, the rack gear on the top of it came up and was sandwiched between a pinion gear and a steel roller on the back side. And by turning this horizontal shaft, that would have brought the gate stem up and down and started or stopped the turbine. In the wheelhouse, we saw the gate stems that came up from the turbines, and that opened and closed the valve that let the water in and started and stopped the turbines. Those shafts were hooked with a rack and pinion gear to a shaft that came into the basement, like this one right here. The gears then meshed here, and you had an additional shaft that went up through the floor into the main level of the mill. And so by turning a hand wheel up in that level, you could start and stop the turbine 2 floors below you. This is a hand wheel that was at least similar to what were used to start and stop the turbines up on the first floor. This one probably serves some different use, but it's a similar sort of thing. So by turning this, you could have opened the gate and opened the water flow onto the turbine to start it, or closed it and stopped the machinery.
This is the flyball governor used to control the speed of the machinery in its original location in the wheelhouse.
As the machine goes faster, these balls by centrifugal force fly out, which then causes the machinery to slow down. And when it slows down, the balls collapse down toward the center, and it makes its speed back up, so it keeps it going at a constant, even speed. So this that we see in the back corner here is the remnants of the bottom of the main elevator. Grain was delivered to the mill and put through a small door that we'll see later out on the outside of the building into this, what was a big bin essentially. But in the center of the bin was the bottom of the bucket elevator that raised the grain all the way to the top of the elevator tower. And the reason why we have the elevator tower on the mill is so it would get the grain up high enough so it could then drop by gravity down to various storage bins on the second floor, or possibly to cleaning equipment. At one time there were 3 windows in the wall of the basement. You can see where this one here was, what's now the newer looking mortar. This was a pretty large window, actually had a window well on the outside, and there were also 2 smaller basement type windows, but water tended to leak into the basement from there, and so those were closed up when the Historical Society did the renovations. That was at the same time that they poured the concrete floor here in the basement to replace the dirt floor. That was in 1976, and that got things more dried out than they ever had been before in the basement. This is an example of a bucket elevator that would have been used with the flour mills. Once the wheat is ground through the mill the first time, it would drop down through a chute like this, down into the bottom of the elevator, which would be located here in the basement. The buckets, as you see over here, would then take the grain up all the way to probably the 3rd floor. So this part up here would actually be located on the 3rd floor. This was just something we had set up here as part of the museum some years ago. The buckets would flip over the top, dumping the grain out into this chute, which would then go down to the processing equipment on the 2nd floor, and from there would come back down to the next roller mill to be ground further, and then go through the same process in a second elevator and so forth all the way through the grinding operation. here we can see just the end of where there had been a timber attached that actually came out here probably about 6 feet. And on that timber, there was a shaft that ran all the way up through the floors, clear to the peak of the roof. You can see the notch in the beam here and a couple of bolts where a bearing would have been attached. And that would have been the same way each of the levels all the way up through the mill. A belt would have come out of the wheelhouse and onto a pulley on the bottom of this shaft. And that would have been what powered all of the machinery on the second floor and above. Second floor, third floor, elevator tower. That's how they all got their powers, from this one shaft.
In 1976, the Historical Society had a cement floor put in the basement where there had previously only been a dirt floor. In 1981, the Society set up a museum in this area, which included much of the milling machinery the Society had acquired from the Pleasant Valley roller mills in Pennsylvania in 1974, along with a display about the pump factory and the chair factory. This photo shows some of the museum in 1983.
Back in the late 1970s, the Historical Society set up a small museum here in the basement of the mill. And one of the people that was a director of the society at the time, Rob Town, was a bit of an artist, and so drew some representations of what the wheelhouse and the mill power setup might have been. And so this shows what we were talking about, how the water from the dam came in through a forebay, down through a wooden penstock, and then you had the various turbines connected to that penstock. You had the shaft then that came up from the turbine, and a belt that went through into the basement onto the shafts that we just saw, and then from there up to the first floor. One of them was hooked up to a bevel gear, so the shaft that the belt actually ran off from was horizontal instead of vertical, but again ran into the basement, and that's what powered the machinery. Once the water escaped, was used by the turbine, it came back out of the tail race back into the river and on down the river. This is another artifact left from the 1970s museum that was here in the basement. Again, something that was painted by Rob Town. And this is a schematic that just is a representation of the various mills that were along the Browns River. As we learned earlier in the video, just over the length of a mile, the river drops 132 feet. And so this gave a number of different opportunities for water power for mills. And that was really the reason why Jericho Corners is where it is. The village was settled around the mills. So just below where we are, the first water power was a sawmill on the west side of the river, and there also was a wool carding and fulling mill on the east side of the river. The next water power is where we are, Chittenden Mills flour mill. The next water power up the river actually was never used. It was very inaccessible, and so it just wasn't worth trying to establish a connection to road to get there. So the next one was actually up on Mill Street and was used for a bunch of different things, most notably the chair factory, which was there in the 1870s and 1880s. Then up on Pump Road was the pump works, which the road was named after. And they made wooden water pumps and water pipe that was used both for homes and also sometimes for communities, villages and cities to have a water system. And water would be going through these wooden water pipes, and if you just had a home well, you'd be pumping it with a wooden water pump. Now of course you had to have a sawmill to make the lumber that you then used to make the water pumps, and so that's what the next mill up the river was, which also was on Pump Road. And then the final one was up on Silly Hill Road, which was again mostly a sawmill, but at one time there was also a oil mill there where they would make linseed oil from flaxseed, and there was a factory there that made wooden butter boxes for the or cheese boxes for the butter and cheese output of the cheese factory in Riverside. Now we're on the first floor of the mill. This door here on the front would have been the main entrance for most customers coming to the mill. And this was also the area where the grinding took place. So this area was been where all of the activity would have happened. Originally, what we see as one big room here now was divided into 2 rooms. We'll describe here a little more in a moment. And today, this is the area that the Historical Society uses for their craft shop. And so you'll notice in the background of the video, there's a lot of things that would not have been appropriate for a mill, but are appropriate for the use it's put to today. Just inside the door, right in this area, there was a set of Fairbanks Moore scales. Again, the equipment that we got from the mill in Pennsylvania had a set of Fairbanks scales virtually identical to the ones here. Those are upstairs, and we'll see a little more of those in a few minutes. So that would have been something where a customer buying some flour or grain or whatever could have weighed his purchase here, or the miller could have weighed it for him. This room in the corner here is the original mill office. And you notice the little window they had here where the clerk, whoever was inside the office, could deal with the customer coming up to the outside of the window. So that would have been where they would have transacted any of the business of the mill. Originally, the first floor of the main mill was divided into 2 rooms. Right about where I'm standing, there was a wall that would have gone across here. And right where I'm standing, there was a double door in that wall to get from one room to the other. On the river side of this, the chimney, this wall that divided the 2 parts of the first floor was actually a double wall. One would have been at the front edge of the chimney, the other at the back edge of the chimney. And in between those 2 walls, there was a stairway that went down into the basement, and a very steep stairway, because this had to go between those timbers that supported the line shaft, and there wasn't too much room. So it was a very steep stairway, and there was a doorway on both sides of the chimney to access it from either the front room or the rear room. Now, about where I'm standing, there was a doorway and went into a stairway that went up to the second floor. When the Historical Society acquired the mill, the flooring was very uneven and also had holes cut in it where the different chutes and so forth had gone through. And so the Historical Society laid a new floor in here that was actually laid on top of 2x6s set up on edge so that they could be cut down or shimmed up as need be to level the floor. And to do that, this whole wall was taken out, the stairways that went both up and down. And so here you can see the framing in the ceiling of the first floor, where originally there was an opening for the stairway, but now has been blocked off to allow the flooring to be laid up on the second floor, the same as it was down here, to level it up. Now the space between the old floor and the new floor had conduit run in it where the electricity could be run, and then was filled with insulation so that this would keep the heat in the proper part of the building, where you didn't have to heat the whole building to heat just one section. Here we see the baseboard along the wall in the mill. This is something that was replaced when the new flooring was laid, and unfortunately was not done in a historic fashion. The top of the original baseboard would have been just cut at a 45-degree angle, no molding or anything. And the reason for that was so that flour dust could not accumulate on that, because flour dust is the bane of a flour mill. It is unfortunately explosive. If it gets poofed into the air a little bit and some spark sets it off, and oftentimes what happens, it'll be just some little poof, but that poof stirs up more dust, and then you have a giant explosion. And so that was something that you avoided at all costs. Any way that you could avoid collecting dust, you did. These are 4 case roller mills, very similar to what was in this mill originally. The original ones were made by the Case Manufacturing Company in Columbus, Ohio, and that company wasn't in business for very long, so a lot of the machinery that was in this mill is really pretty scarce. Unfortunately, it also disappeared years ago. What happened in this mill is after George Clerkin, who was the head miller for the house, died in 1904, flour making ceased. The roller mills were sold, and after that, they were just making animal feed here. Back in 1974, I belonged to a group called the Society for the Preservation of Old Mills. And in their newsletter, they had a brief article about the Pleasant Valley Roller Mills in West Leesport, Pennsylvania, which was being torn down as part of the Army Corps of Engineers Blue Marsh Lake project. This was a project where they were building a dam across the valley and flooding the entire valley to create a water supply and a recreation area for the city of Reading. This was about 10 miles outside of Reading. And so part of the buildings that were going to be torn down to make way for this project were the Pleasant Valley roller mills. So the Army Corps of Engineers was selling off all of the equipment in the mill before they tore the building down. And lo and behold, what they had were case roller mills. This picture shows the roller mills that the Historical Society acquired when they were still in the Pleasant Valley roller mills in West Leesport. And also in the background, you can see some of the elevators that went with the equipment that we also acquired. So the Historical Society got in touch with the former owner of the mill, Mrs. Anna Wiedenheimer, and she gave us the information on what was what with the machinery and gave us the contact information to get in touch with the Corps of Engineers. Found out that they were putting this up on a sealed bid. So the Historical Society bid on the items that we thought we wanted for this mill as both a historical display, and at that time the hope was to set up some kind of a small operating mill as a historical museum. That unfortunately never happened, but we did acquire the machinery. So we put in our bids on the sealed bid, but they obviously had an appraiser go through and appraise the machinery, and so most everything had a minimum bid on it. And well, this was way more than the Historical Society could afford, so we put in bids that were below the minimums, and virtually all of our bids were rejected. However, it turned out that we were the only people that bid on it. So the machinery was put up for bid a second time with the minimum bids either reduced or eliminated. And so the second time bidding, the Historical Society actually bid less than what they did the first time, and we won everything. And so then we got a group of volunteers together, and we'd go down. At that time, I was working a second shift, so I got out of work at 12:30 at night. We'd gather everybody together on 12:30 on Friday morning and drive all night to Pennsylvania, then spend all day Friday, all day Saturday, and about half the day on Sunday dismantling the equipment, getting it ready to move. We did this for several weekends. Finally, everything was ready to move. Then we rented a tractor-trailer truck from Norton's Trucking, and they met us down at the mill at 6 a.m. on one morning, and we spent all day from 6 in the morning until after dark at night loading equipment into this tractor-trailer. And we got everything in it except for the flour sifter, which we'll hear more about. That's upstairs, and we'll show it to you a little later. And brought everything back here, and the roller mills were stored in a barn here in Jericho for a while, then were brought back to the mill, and we had a small museum set up down in the basement, and these were set up down there as part of that. But after a while, the basement is kind of damp and not the best climate for machinery like this, and so we brought the roller mills up here. So today, they are essentially identical to the original machinery that was in this mill, and essentially in the identical location.
Roller mills were lined up in a similar location to where they are today, and in this photo you can clearly see the belts coming up through the floor from the line shaft in the basement. There were roller mills for making wheat flour, buckwheat flour, and cornmeal, as well as a 30-inch burr mill.
They're sitting right above the line shaft that would have been in the basement to power them. And they would have been slots in the floor with belts coming up and running over these pulleys. The pulleys are belted together, and then a second belt would run over the top of those and down through the floor onto the line shaft, and that's what would have powered the roller mills. Grain is coming down through these chutes into, these are a double mill now, so it comes down in one chute into one half of the mill, be ground, drop down into the basement, taken back up to the upper levels of the mill in an elevator, then gone through some processing machinery up there, then come back down in a second chute to be ground again, and so on down through the process. And the gradual reduction process, what this is called, it supposedly gave a better, finer, whiter flour than just grinding once with a set of millstones had done. This mechanism allowed the miller to divert the grain from one side of the rolls to the other to equalize the flow onto the feeder mechanism that vibrated and spread it out even more evenly. So this is a close-up of one of the roller mills. You can open this door and see the actual rolls in here. This mechanism up here, as the grain is coming down this chute, this actually vibrates back and forth, and that would shake the grain out so it would fall evenly onto the rollers, not just all in one spot. And the rollers are turning against each other to grind the grain, but one of them is turning faster than the other. So there's a shearing action. These rolls here, as we'll see in a moment, are corrugated, and so that would help to grind the grain, break the wheat berry up into smaller pieces. And then it goes through some sifting equipment and then comes back down. And so as we go down the line, the corrugations first get finer, and then the rolls actually are, the last of them are actually smooth. And so that makes gives the ability to grind the particles of grain into flour finer and finer. Once the grain went through the rolls and was milled, the miller could open this door, reach in and grab some grain in his hand to check it and see how it was doing, if it was the right consistency or if the rolls needed to be adjusted. They could be adjusted closer together or farther apart. And also the two rolls want to be level. They don't want to be tilted relative to each other. And there's actually a tool called a tram plate that could be laid on top of them, and you would be able to tell if they were in tram or not. This, as you can see cast into it, is called a leveling plate, but it's often called a tram plate as well. These four edges on each side and on the bottom of those are machined so that they're perfectly square and level to each other. And what you would do with this is set it on top of the rolls, and you'd want them to set perfectly level so this wouldn't rock at all. Because if it rocked, that meant that the rolls weren't parallel to each other, that they were tilted, and so they wouldn't grind as well. So this was how you check your machinery every now and then to make sure everything was in tram. This machine is called a magnetic separator. The idea behind it being if there was any kind of metal mixed in with the grain, like a nut that fell off the harvester or something, it could be really detrimental to those rollers that we were just looking at in the roller mills. And so you'd put your grain through a machine like this, and the grain would just fall off the front, but the magnets under this piece of metal would hold any metal that was mixed in so it wouldn't get into the machinery. This machine, as far as we know, isn't like anything that was ever in this mill originally, but it was donated to the Historical Society by a man that owned an old mill down in Poultney, Vermont. And it's it's contemporary to the mill, and it's just kind of an interesting piece of machinery, so we acquired it just to have here on display. This is the flour packer that was part of the equipment that we purchased in Pennsylvania at the Pleasant Valley Roller Mills, but it is fortunate, it is absolutely identical to the original flour packer that was in this mill, made by the Richmond City Mill Works in Richmond, Indiana.
This is a photo of Frank Howe beside the Richmond City Mill Works flour packer, which is in the same location it is today.
And what this was for is to fill barrels with flour. There was a smaller version of this that could be used to fill just bags and so forth. And the part up at the top is where the flour would have come down from a storage bin on the second floor. There's an agitator in here that stirs the flour so it doesn't clog up and keeps flowing down. The platform down at the bottom where the barrel is sitting on actually would have been started out being raised up part way, and as the flour filled the barrel, the barrel would get heavier and it would keep moving down and moving down and moving down until it got to the point where it was full, in which case it tripped a mechanism that stopped it from filling any further. This is the Richmond Bran Duster, again a machine that came from Pennsylvania, but again is absolutely identical to the original one that was in this mill that we'll see remnants of up on the third floor. This would have originally been on the third floor of the mill, but is just down here for display for the historic purposes. What this was used for is once the flour is separated from the bran, there still is a little bit of flour clinging to the bran. And so that would be run through this machine to dust the bran and retrieve a little more flour so you'd make your operation a little more economical. This is made by the Richmond Manufacturing Company of Lockport, New York. So the same Richmond name as the flour packer, but a totally different company. We've talked about how most of the stone walls on the first floor of the mill date back to the 1857 version of the mill. But obviously when it was rebuilt in 1885, they did make some changes. And here's one that's rather obvious. You can see where there had been a window here that got closed in at that point. You can see the stone lintel would have crossed the top and the window opening. There's another one in the other side of this back wall that's the same way. Those were closed off because of the addition of this storehouse building on the back of the mill. Right now we're in the rear portion of the ground floor of the mill. And this, originally when the mill was operating, this would have been just a storehouse area, probably where they would have stored barrels of flours once they'd manufactured them before they were able to ship them out. Once the mill stopped operating and was converted to use for automobile repair, this area was where that automobile repair took place. So all of this in all of those times was just one big open room. Today, the Historical Society has divided it up into several rooms. So there's an office and a kitchen and some storage space and the Snowflake Bentley room and a toilet and the furnace room and so forth. But all of this originally was just one big open room. One of the interesting stories, the person that converted this from a mill to the automobile repair use was Floyd White and his father George. And George told the story of how when they converted this over, they poured a cement floor in here. And he'd bought enough cement to use to make the whole floor, hired a couple of high school kids to help him do the work. Well, as it turns out, he had to go somewhere for a little while and left the high school kids to work on the cement floor. When he got home, he found out that they'd used up all of the cement, but only half of the floor was finished. They'd put too much cement in the mix. So he thought this was probably going to be a pretty solid floor that would never have any problems. Actually, after the Historical Society bought the mill, they poured a second cement floor on top of the original one just to level it up. And so it's a little higher than what it would have been in the prior days. As you can see from this part of the mill to the first floor in the main part of the building, there's a ramp to get up because they're at slightly different levels. And when this was back in the days when this was used for automobile repair, there was actually a giant lump of blacktop there that was used as a step to get from this level up into the next part of the mill. We're now on the second floor of the main mill building. The front part of this area was originally divided up into bins to store grain. Starting on the parking lot side, just in front of the window, and bins would have gone all the way down this wall, not all one big bin, but divided up into several small ones. Then where I'm standing, they would have been a walkway that would have enabled people to get down to the window on the front. Then in the center of the building, there were more bins, then another walkway in front of that second window, and a bin in the far corner, a walkway to that farther window, and then more bins coming back to the stairway to the third floor. Altogether, these bins would have held something in the neighborhood of 187 tons of wheat. This part of the building, at the floor level in this level, is the top of the stone walls. The walls in this level and above in the mill are actually 2x6 plank laid flat, one top of the other. So it's a 6-inch solid wood wall. And that, along with these beams you see all around bolted to the walls, gave it the strength to hold up that amount of weight. The rear section of this area would have been for processing equipment. And we know what some of the items in this area were. There was a thing called a middlings purifier.
This advertisement from the March 26, 1886 issue of the Northwest Miller depicts a case middlings purifier, very similar to what would have been here on the second floor of the mill.
And there was a case centrifugal reel. There was some other sort of a reel that had previously been in the previous mill and was reused when this mill was erected. But it's not exactly clear just how things were all located and connected together. Not a whole lot of information on that sort of thing. This one bin that you see in the back corner here was the only storage bin in this area, and that was what was always referred to as the oat bin. So apparently it was used to store oats in, but don't know any more about it than that. When we were in the basement, we mentioned a shaft that ran vertically up through the mill to power the equipment on the upper floors, and this is the bearing block that would have held the bearing to hold that vertical shaft, and you can as well see the hole in the floor going up to the third floor where the shaft would have continued on up to that level as well. That would have been what would have powered all of the machinery on these upper floors. After the mill closed, the grain bins that were in this area were all removed. They were made out of what was at the time called matched lumber, what today we'd call tongue and groove. And so they salvaged all of the material from those to use for other purposes. So this left this all with one big open room just like it is today. So some enterprising person built a small room across the front part of the mill. And when I say a room, it was just a few 2x4s thrown up and then covered over with tar paper. So it sort of enclosed it, but not tremendously. And they used this area as a shooting gallery. And so in this room that they'd closed off, they had a stove in there and a stovepipe that ran out through a hole in the window.
In this photo, we can see the stovepipe coming out of the window. This was a warming space for the people who used this floor as a shooting gallery. Scars remain in the rear wall from the bullets hitting there.
They were shooting from about where I'm standing down at the back wall. As I mentioned, these walls were solid 6-inch thick wood, and the bullets were using 22s apparently, and they left pock marks in this wood wall, so it chewed into the wood an inch or two in places. Unfortunately, that's not very evident today because when they laid the new flooring up here, it raised the floor up enough so it covered those marks. Apparently they were firing just from the prone position, so all the marks were down at floor level. When the new floor was laid here, the bottom of this stairway going up to the third floor was cut off, and there's been some supports put under it just to keep it in place, including these 2x4s you see in the picture. So when they were using this as a firing range, that wouldn't have been there, and this would have been a clear view down to the back wall, which would be where they would have been firing at. So a range of about 50 feet or so. This edge of the stairway originally would have butted up against the wall of the grain bin that was located in this area. So that's why it kind of hangs out and looks a little scraggly, because it was just butting up to wherever the edge of the bin was. This edge of the stairway was open to the area where the processing equipment was, and so consequently it has a more finished look to it as opposed to the other side that was up against the grain bins. And this access to the stairs originally was from this side through a curved steps and up the stairs, but due to the replacement of the flooring, the bottom of the stairs had to be cut off and rebraced and so forth, and so the access is now on the other side, but that was just a temporary fix. These 3 beams along this wall were located here to support a shaft, the location of which is you can see by the paint marks in the paint. It would have been a horizontal shaft running along here, undoubtedly powered by a belt from that vertical shaft that we just mentioned running up through. And then belts would have run off from this shaft to power the processing equipment that was located in this area. The only thing that we really know about that is if you look on this post, you can see a mark going up here and a further mark way up at the top, and that would have been where a pulley would have been on here. And the actual pulley is now down in the basement of the mill, was moved down there to have in the museum a few years ago. And but this shows you the size of it, which had been probably about a 4-foot diameter pulley. The tin was put on the post so the belt wouldn't wear into the wood if it got off the center of the pulley a little bit. We're now on the 3rd floor of the mill. This was mainly just an area where there was a lot of chutes running around to distribute the grain to the various machines and bins and so forth on the lower floors, but there was some processing equipment up here as well. The main one was this thing called a case centrifugal reel. And again, that was one thing that could get more flour out of some of the bran and so forth, kind of like a bran duster, so it made the process more economical. And you have the horizontal conveyor just above it that would have brought the grain from some chute up higher down, and so it would enter the machine. The reel would have been turning, and the products separated out came down into this part at the bottom, and that's actually a 2-compartment horizontal conveyor. And so there are cutoff bins in there, we'll see in a moment, that you could have cut off the grain at whatever point so you could sort it out as you wanted to have it. These slides that move back and forth would have been regulated all the way down through, and that would be how you would determine where the cutoff was between one quality of flour and the other. Like so much of the machinery at the mill, this one was torn apart after the mill stopped running, and the iron parts were taken out and sold for scrap iron. Originally, in this area you're looking at, they would have been a round reel that would have been turning, and that would have been what processed the grain. And you can see the 2 compartments at the bottom where they would have been separated out into 2 different categories. These 2 heavy timbers we see running along parallel to each other would have supported a shaft connected to this vertical shaft that we have been talking about that ran up from the basement to power the equipment up here. A belt from that would have run up to that pulley we see up above, and we see just to the right of it a windlass. That would have had a rope wrapped around it, which would have extended down to the lower floors, and they could have hitched on something like a bag of grain and hoisted it up to this level using that. This is the top of another bucket elevator. Not quite sure what its purpose was. The pulley you see up there is what would have been powered off from this horizontal shaft that we've been talking about. And that would have brought grain up from some lower level and brought it up to either some of the equipment on this level or possibly down to some other bin or something on the 2nd floor. Once the grain had been carried up to the top of the main elevator by the main elevator to the top of the elevator tower, it fell then by gravity down to the various storage bins or machinery or whatever, and it had to be able to be diverted from one place to another. This is an example of how that would have happened. You have this chute coming down, which carries on down to a bin over further to the left, but then it could be also diverted down this chute to a bin further to the right. So when grain needed to be diverted from one bin to another, that was done by opening a door in the chute. The grain would have been going down here. Now you can lift up this door here, and now the grain will be diverted down the other chute. And you'll notice for this to lift up and down, the hinges here are actually made out of leather. Probably stood up to the wear of the grain better. People that worked in the mill have told me that the machinery was set up so that for the most part, everything could be operated from the 1st floor. And to make that happen, machines up on the upper floors had ropes and so on hooked onto them that they could pull on from the 1st floor to change things on the machinery up here. So they only actually came up to the upper floors maybe once a week just to oil the bearings and so forth. So this is an example of some pulleys where ropes would have been hooked to a machine, come over, ran around these pulleys, and then down to another one you'll see in a moment, and then from there on down to the 1st floor. Ropes from the pulleys we just saw would then have come down, ran over these pulleys, and from here down, straight down through to the 1st floor where they could be pulled on to control the machinery. This is just an example of some of the multitude of chutes that ran around the various parts of this floor to get the grain from one area to another. We've spoken about the shaft bringing power up from the basement to the upper floors. This is where it came up through the floor onto this level, and these 4 timbers, and when I say 4 timbers, you're going to say, gee, I only see 3. That's because one was taken out to be able to remove the shafting back when it was sold for scrap iron. But these 4 timbers are what supported the top of that shaft, and the 2 heavy timbers running horizontally are what supported a horizontal shaft that this shaft connected into, and that shaft running along that powered the equipment on this floor. This is another small bin whose actual use is lost in the mists of time, but we have another interesting feature we want to show. This is the bottom of that small bin, and you can see by the hole here, it would have had a pivot chute on a pivot on the bottom of that it could have gone back and forth, so that it would have dropped the grain down in any one of these 4 openings depending on where you wanted it. So it's just a rather curious little arrangement. Over the years, of course, a lot of people visited the mill because it was such an attractive building, and a lot of them toured the upper levels as well. And a few of them even took time to sign their names, and this is one of the more interesting ones. It reads, Olive Larkin, Jess Walker, August 21st, 1909, seeing the sights in Jericho. This machine was one that was found here on the 3rd floor of the mill when the Historical Society acquired the mill. Its use is absolutely unknown, is lost in the mists of time. The only thing we can tell is on the top here it would have had some sort of a fan to blow air through, obviously to sort material in some fashion, but no idea what it was for, anything about it. This is the brand duster that was originally in this mill, very similar to the one that we saw down on the 1st floor that came from Pennsylvania. This is also a Richmond's Empire Conical Brand Duster and Bolt, again made by the Richmond Manufacturing Company in Lockport, New York. This one, after the mill closed, just like everything else, they stripped all of the iron off from it, and so the top cover of this is something that the Historical Society has pieced back together. It was just a pile of boards scattered around the floor when we got here, where they stripped it apart to salvage what they could. As I mentioned, dust in a flour mill is something you want to avoid at all costs, and the operation of making flour does create dust. In modern mills, they have machines that are called dust collectors, but in a mill of this vintage, they had what they call dust rooms, and this is an example of the remnants of one that was in this mill. So you'd frame in a small area, just very lightly framed, and then cover the outside of it with something like cheesecloth, muslin, and then the dust from the machines would be blown into here. The air could escape out through the cloth walls, and the dust would settle into the room, so it would prevent the dust from accumulating inside the building. This is the most intact one left in this building, but there was another one over on the other side of this level that did the same purpose. This shaft powered the equipment in the small cupola on the back part of the mill. That was how power got transferred into that part of the building. The end of the horizontal shaft that we've spoken of that powered the equipment here on the 3rd floor ended right here with a coupling that would have mated with this coupling that remains connected to the shaft we just saw going out across the roof to the cupola on the back part of the mill. And in that cupola, there is a lever that moves this shaft horizontally, so it would either have engaged this or disengaged it, depending on whether you were intending to use the equipment out there or not. Also, right in this area on that horizontal shaft, there was a pulley and a belt that ran up that powered the main elevator that we'll see up in the top of the elevator tower. This is the stairway going up to the 1st level in the elevator tower. We're now in the 1st level of the elevator tower, and this was an area below my feet here where the power shaft was running. Connected to that power shaft was a belt running up through to the top of the main elevator, which we'll see in a few minutes. And so this little partition here was so that for somebody that was happened to be going up this next set of stairs, they wouldn't get tangled up in the belt. This mechanism was presumably some sort of a belt tightener. There would have been some kind of an idler pulley on here that would have pressed on this belt running up through, so this would have been able to start and stop the elevator. This rope would have come over around this pulley and then again run down through, so they could have controlled this whole mechanism from down on the lower levels. Given the size of this elevator tower, the vibration from the machinery that would have been in here, just the wind load on the outside of it and so on, they made it pretty structurally solid. One of the interesting things is these braces that run along so that you can see that we're connected to the floor joists, so that would have given additional bracing, additional strength. We had mentioned earlier about the walls from the 2nd floor up being solid plank 2x6 laid on flat on top of each other. This shows you a little bit of that right up at the peak of that wall. And also the rafter is for the roof are running on top of that, but these sticks you can just see the ends of here are the supports that run out about 2 feet that support the soffits on the side of the mill. This is another reel. We're not quite sure just what the use of it was, but fortunately for the historic purposes, it remained relatively intact when most everything else in the mill was scrapped. You can see the reels themselves up in the top part. That would have been covered with some sort of a bolting cloth, suitable size for whatever the purpose would have been, and it would sort material as it went through this, and this would drop down into different places at the bottom, and by pulling out or pushing in on these slides, you could determine where that material ended up. Down one chute here, perhaps down a chute over there, down a chute over here, and so forth. This would have been powered by a belt on a pulley on the farther end, unfortunately now missing, that would have come down to the power shafts that we just saw, the location of. This pulley up here would have been powered by the pulley and belt on the farther end of the machine. This belt here coming down powers a screw conveyor that transfers the material horizontally once it's gone through the reel. The other interesting thing, we wonder if this machine may actually have been custom made for the mill, because you notice on the front it has a long leg going down, where the back is actually sitting on the framing of the building. So it just ends, the frame custom part of the machine just ends here. So this might have even been something that wasn't really factory made, but was just custom made for this building. We're now in the small cupola next to the chimney, where the chute from the main elevator came down to the forward part of the building. So that would have come in through the wall of the cupola just up here, and then as you can see, there are various branches that diverged off where it would have been able to direct the grain to all kinds of different areas of the front of the mill. We're now looking back out the window in the small cupola, and what you see out the window is actually the front wall of the main elevator tower, and just below what you're seeing out of sight is the window where the chute would have come out to come down to here. We're now on the second or main level of the elevator tower. Fortunately, this is one that has a pretty complete floor even. You can see the stairs here that will go on up to the second or the third level, the upper level we'll talk about, and otherwise here we are. This rolling screen we see laying over on the floor here would have been used to separate materials. When we look closer, you can see that the mesh on different parts of it is different amounts of coarseness, and so different material would fell through each section. That originally was up in this apparatus that you see up above here, the wooden framework, and so some of the material, once it went through the screen, would have fallen down this chute and come down here. Other material would have come down this chute, down into another chute, and then some would have come down this piece over here. So it would have separated out into different parts. The idea of why it's down here on the floor now was, years ago, the Historical Society had the thought that it might be able to be reused one day if we were to set up the machinery we had acquired in Pennsylvania as a museum. This could be put in the back part of the mill and used. And they were having a crane here to do some work on the roof, and we thought maybe we could hoist this out the window and put it into the back part of the mill. Well, that plan fell through, so the reel is just sitting here on the floor at this point. This little bin, we've no idea what it was used for, but it obviously was used to store something in. You can see these slots on each side here would have allowed boards to be slid in here to enclose it, and probably something maybe that came down from that rolling screen that was being sorted. It might have been stored in here temporarily. As we had mentioned, oftentimes when they had the opportunity, people like to visit the mill and come to the upper levels, especially up here where you got a good view out the windows of the village. And oftentimes they would sign their names, as you can see on this board here. One of the interesting ones is a signature here from Hiram F. Tilley on February 28th, 1916. He lived in the brick house across from what today is the Jericho Town Hall. What we're looking at here is the remnants of the main elevator for the mill. This side over here, you can see the buckets that would have been coming up all the way from the bin in the basement, all the way up through the building, over the top of the pulley we'll see in a moment up above, then coming back down on this side. All of this would have been enclosed in a wooden box like this, all the way down through to the basement. The grain from the top of the main elevator came down to one of two chutes, either to go to the back part of the mill or the front. Going to the front, it came down this chute we see here, out through this window, and inside through a little opening in the back of this little small cupola we see just in back of the chimney. And then from there, down chutes that we saw earlier. Looking at this view on a nice sunny day, you can see why people wanted to come up to the cupola to get the view. We're still in the second level of the elevator tower, looking out the window down at the roof of the Wheelhouse. And we can see a little bit of the river going by. The river, give or take, is about 100 feet below where we are at this time. Now we're looking at the very top of the main elevator in the third level of the elevator tower. So the buckets that we just saw are inside of this housing. And this big wooden pulley over here is what would have been driven by the belt coming up from that shaft down on the third floor to power it. You can still see in the center the bearing that this turned on. The bearing on the ends on each end were removed when they stripped out the scrap iron. Another interesting thing is over the years with the grain coming over and centrifugal force dumps it out of the buckets and so it goes down the chutes, but it wore through the wood. And so they put this little piece of tin on there to just patch the hole up. This area that we're looking at here is where that rolling screen that we just saw laying on the floor down on the level below actually was located back in operating days. Here you see the framing for the inside of the cupola roof, and up at the very top of the roof is the little small cupola where the finial is located on. Again, we can see here where the top grain coming down from the top of the elevator diverged, this chute going out the back window, that chute over there going out the front window. And again, a clever little place where the boards apparently were worn through from the grain hitting it over the years, so they patched it up with an Edgeworth tobacco can. Where the chutes from the main elevator diverged, this one came down toward the back part of the mill and out through the window. We're now on the second floor of the rear part of the mill, and most of what is stored in this area is some of the equipment that we got from the mill in Pennsylvania that is not otherwise on display here in the mill. One of the things that we got there is this big long box you see here. This is called a Wolf level sifter made by the Wolf Manufacturing Company in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And this is not like anything that was ever in this mill, but it was part of the mill setup that we bought, and it kind of came with it. And we had the hope when we first bought it that this was going to be something we could set up as a demonstration operation, and so this would have been a critical part of that operation. How this works is, as I mentioned, there are 8 pairs of rolls in 4 double stands of roller mills. And this Wolf sifter has 8 sections to it. 1 here, here, 3rd, 4th, and then 4 more on the other end. And so the wheat would be ground through the first set of rolls, go to the first section of the sifter, be sifted, and then things that came out of the sifting operation might go some to the second set of rolls, some maybe to the 4th set of rolls, some might go to another section of the sifter, and so forth and so on. It sorted it all out as to where it needed to go. And this would just keep getting processed over and over again until you got to the farther end when you ended up with flour. Now this box, as you see it sitting here, is actually sitting up on edge. What you're looking at is the top of it. This would have been setting horizontally and hanging from the ceiling by 24 wooden dowels like these, 6 on each corner. And these would have been, if it was vertical, it was hanging from, it had a gearbox, we'll see in a minute, that made the box oscillate, and that's what caused the flour to sift through the silk bolting cloths and do the sifting. The rest of the shafting and pulleys and so forth here, some of it was the drive mechanism for the sifter, some of it went with the elevators that we'll see in just a moment, and so forth and so on. This mechanism here, it would have sat on the floor underneath the sifter, and it would have been connected to the sifter body by cloth tubes like this, and the idea being, with the box oscillating, this gave it some flexibility, but the different flour and grain products would have been able to sift down through it and end up down in the bottom part, which then has a screw conveyor that moves this product along to the end, and it would drop out onto the next process of the processing. And different chutes here would allow it, so it would have gone to multiple different places. These are the Fairbanks scales, again, that came from Pennsylvania, but that are identical to what were down by the front door in this mill originally. This plate and the frame that goes around it would have been flush with the floor, and then these columns coming up in the weighing mechanism to weigh the product. Over in the far corner are the elevator legs. These are the wooden tubes that the belts up on the next floor above us that have the tin buckets on them would have run inside of to carry the material. Once it had gone through the roller mills and dropped to the basement level, this would have carried it up to probably the third level, where then it could have dropped by gravity down to the second level to the level sifter to be sifted. What's over in this next pile are just chutes. They would have been things where the grain would have come down by gravity. This is a panel that would have hung above the level sifter. It's upside down right now, so these tin circles would have been what those cloth tubes would have hooked to and come down and hooked to the top of the sifter to allow the grain to get into the sifter while it was moving. These, kind of hidden under some of the other equipment, are the bottoms of the bucket elevators. The grain would have been coming down a chute into these openings. The buckets on the belt are coming down on the backside around a pulley and coming up through this chute, so they grab the material as it falls in and carry it on up to the upper floors. It is very difficult to move grain products along horizontally. That's why the mill is set up so as much as possible things drop vertically by gravity. But occasionally you do have to move it horizontally, and this, called a screw conveyor, is what would have helped to make that possible. This thing would be inside of a box just big enough for it to fit in, and the bottom corners of the box would have had a 45-degree chamfer piece put in, so this thing would be turning and it would cause the grain to move along horizontally. Now this is an early version out of this mill. Over here we see a more modern version, does the same thing, made out of metal, and these are ones that came out of the mill in Pennsylvania. This is another sifting machine that came from Pennsylvania. Not really clear about the specific use for it, but grain would have fed into this top part. This whole thing is on a vibrating table, so it vibrates back and forth quite rapidly, and the material would come down. Some would sifted through these holes, others would have just tailed off the end. There's actually a finer mesh screen down below that would do a second sort, and so this would sort material out into several different categories. This is a feeding machine that would have fed material into one of the other machines. This came from Pennsylvania, but it's similar to the Jericho one that is up on the next level. This is the gearbox that goes in the center of the level sifter. This would have had a belt on this pulley to power it. The pulley would have turned, causing that very heavy weight down below to spin around in a circle. That spinning, in turn, was what would have caused the box to oscillate as it hung on these 24 wooden dowels to cause the flour to sift through. These are the bottoms of some more of the elevators. Again, a chute would have gone on there. The belt was coming down this side around and scoops up whatever comes down that chute and carries it on up to the upper floors. This is the bottom of another elevator, and this is opened up enough where you can see the pulley inside that the belt would have been running around on. This building was designed with heavier construction than what might normally have been in just a farm barn or something. One of the things is these metal rods that go out through the outside of the building and then come in about 2 feet and are bolted through the timber. So that would have been able to hold the sides of the building together more readily. And so the beams in this area have cleats nailed on them with slots in between, so planks could have been dropped in there to build it up to whatever height you wanted, and then this area could have been filled full of grain. So it would have held quite a lot of weight. These are the stairs that go up to the third and fourth levels of the rear part of the mill. This wall here is the back wall of the main mill building, and this here is the front wall of the rear portion. When they moved this portion up to attach to the main mill, they left about a 4-foot space in between, and that gave them an opportunity to put in stairs so they could get from the second floor up to the upper level of this part of the building. This is the stairs going up here. The odd part about it was this opening that I'm standing in wasn't here. There was no way to get to the level we're on other than with a ladder. And so after the Historical Society bought the mill, we cut this opening so we'd have access to this level just from the stairs. We're now on the third level of the rear part of the mill. This area today is basically just used for storage for a couple of different things. One, once the machinery was stripped out of the mill and the iron was sold off for scrap metal, all of the wooden parts were just stashed up here. So there's remnants of several of the machines, but certainly no complete machine or anything. Also, we spoke about the machinery that the Historical Society acquired from the Pleasant Valley roller mills down in Pennsylvania. Parts from that machinery are stored up here as well. This is remnants of a Eureka flour feeder and mixer that was originally in this mill. It was manufactured by the W.B. McMurray Company from Cedar Falls, Iowa. Another interesting stencil on the other side of this Eureka mixer. Good luck to all the millers who use this flour feeder and mixer. What we're looking at now back under the eaves is the top portion of the case middlings purifier that was originally in this mill. And what's in front of it are the bucket elevators, or the buckets for the elevators for the flour mills that came from the mill in Pennsylvania. The top of that middlings purifier that we just saw contained a fan, and this we're looking at now would have been the cover part of the fan that sat on top of the part we just saw. That fan turning would have created a suction, and that was what sucked the bran away from the middlings. And that's how they got purified, by sucking the bran off from them. Most of the case machinery in the mill were framed with about 3 by 3 inch pieces of hard wood like this one. This particular piece came from the case cornmeal aspirator and purifier. These are some of the internal parts, again, of the case middlings purifier. These would have fit inside of that timber framework. The cover that we saw would have been on top of these, and these pieces would have actually moved back and forth to sift the middlings around so that the suction could suck the bran off from them. This building is constructed a little heavier than a normal building of the period would have been because of all the weight that would have been in it from the stored grain. And so this iron rod that you see going across the building to anchor the two sides together to keep it from spreading out was just one additional piece to help support the building. The opening we see in the floor matches the one in the floor above it and the floor below it, and all of them together, if they were open, would then allow the grain bags to be hoisted up with the windlass from the ground floor all the way up as far as they needed to go. On the upper level, there was I guess you'd call it kind of a bin that you could dump grain into. That would fall down through this chute here and then down into a storage bin on the second floor below us. This is a lot of just miscellaneous chutes and so forth that have been piled up in this area. You see under the, whatever this might be here, a barrel. This looks to be something that was homemade, some kind of a feeding mechanism, because it looks like it was just made out of a wooden box as it's stenciled on it, medicated. And then you've got two little chutes that would have come out of it for the grain to go down to somewhere. This whole apparatus here is the cover, again, of some sort of an aspirator or something kind of like the middlings purifier. The housing over here would have been enclosing a fan, and some of these other pieces here probably are some of the rest of the machine, but who knows after all this time. Another pile of odds and ends of the machinery that had once been in this mill. This piece here appears to be the center part of some kind of a purifier. And the interesting thing about this, it would originally have been hanging by these pieces, one on each corner. And you see they're fairly wide, then they thin up very narrow. And originally they probably would have been about a foot or 15 inches long. And the other end would have flared back out wide and been hitched to something up above. The reason for this thinness was that allowed flexibility, and this would have been able to move back and forth. This area in the middle would have been covered with this sort of cloth, fairly fine mesh, and so it would have been allowed something fine to sift through it and the coarser material to fall off the end. The mechanism on the other end here would have been where the material fed in. Again, we got different controls here to regulate the flow and so forth. Below it, this thing that it's sitting on was the bottom of some kind of a reel, so the material would have been filtered through some mesh cloth and sorted out into this part, bottom part. This over here is an example of one of those reels, and you can barely see down there, there's another one. And just all kinds of miscellaneous, who knows what they were. The Wolf level sifter that we saw down on the lower floor has 8 sections to it. The equipment that we bought, the roller mills, there are 4 roller mills. Each one has 2 pairs of rollers. So the wheat gets ground a total of 8 times. And each time after it's ground, it comes up to one level of the sifter. And these are the internal parts of that sifter. So there's 8, one stack here would be one section of the sifter, then you have another and another and so forth. And each one of these has various features to it. This is a silk bolting cloth, so the really fine flour would sift through that. Something that was a little coarser would tail off the other end and drop down to another processing level and just go on from there. So this pile here we're going to take apart and give you a little better idea of it. This would be the top level, so some things might sift through this cloth here and go down to the level below it. Other things might just tail down through an opening here and so on. So then we get down to the next level. We see this is just a wire mesh, so this would be sorting out something that's really coarse from the things that are only kind of middle-sized. The next level, again, is a wire, but it's a little finer mesh wire. So again, it would sorted things out. And again, these goes to different processing equipments from there. This next level, we get down into the silk bolting cloths. And you can imagine those would clog up from just the flour and wheat and so on getting into it. And so to keep those open and not get clogged, they put locust beans in the machine. And those would rattle around on the silk and keep it clean. And as they worked on, they would work their way down to the bottom of this level. Well, what do you do when it gets down to the bottom? You have an elevator to bring them back up. What this has is a spiral of tin inside. And you can see here the opening. The bean would go in here. The motion of the sifter would cause it to go around and around and around until it got up to the top. It would come back out here, back into this level, and then it would be able to go down through again. And this is just further levels of the same sort of thing all the way down through. This would have been a door panel on some processing machine. And it's just kind of interesting. You could obviously lift it out if you needed to get into the machine. But while the machine was operating, you also have a window, so you can look in and see what's happening inside the machine to see if things are working properly. I'm not at all sure what this piece was used for, but it was just kind of an interesting thing. It has a slide that you could move along to either open or close these openings, so material could have run down through it or been closed off. Don't know beyond that what it was for. This is a bucket full of a tool that was called a mill bill. And what these are used for is to sharpen millstones. This would have fit into a handle and you would have lifted it up and dropped down onto the millstone, and it would chip the stone away very slightly, and you just keep working away at this to sharpen it. This one is actually stamped on it. It was made by the John Hallahan Company of Boston, Massachusetts. And we might not think of that at first, but millstones have furrows cut in them so that wheat drops into the center and it has a space to fit into. But as these furrows get out closer to the outside edge of the stone, they get shallower and shallower until they just smooth out as the wheat gets ground finer and finer into flour. But these furrows wear down after the stone has been used for a while, and so it has to be sharpened. And so you'd use a tool like this. The miller would hold it like this, raise it up with one hand, and drop it down. And just the weight of the tool dropping would chip the stone enough to sharpen it. We're now in the cupola on the rear portion of the mill. And what we're looking at up in the very top of that cupola is a windlass. Down below our feet, there were trap doors in each level all the way to the ground level. And if you opened all of those with this windlass, you'd be able to hoist a bag of grain up to any level along up through the building. Now that windlass was powered by the shaft we've been looking at that comes from the main part of the mill out across the roof of this section of the building, comes into this part of the building, and this lever would have been moved back and forth to either engage or disengage the shaft from the main power shaft in the other part of the mill, the coupling that we saw in there. Once you had that shaft turning, this pulley would be turning, and so then the next step would be to move this lever back and forth, and with that is a belt tightener that would have tightened or loosened this belt right here and would cause the windlass to either start or stop turning. All of that was controlled by ropes that went down to the lower level. So this slot in this stick originally had a pulley in it, and there's some other ones here we'll see in a moment, and all of that would allow the control from lower level. Where you see these new boards are the patch that was put on the wall after the chute that brought the grain from the main elevator down to this part of the building was removed. These pulleys, it appears, might have been hooked to this iron rod that would have started and stopped the whole mechanism in this part of the building to operating. This is the remnant of the chute that came from the main elevator tower down into this part of the building. When they disassembled it, they apparently just slid it in through the wall, and it's been laying here ever since. We're not entirely sure, but we believe these are used when they brought grain in bags up with the windlass we just saw, and then would dump them down into these chutes and down to bins on the second level. We hope you've enjoyed the story of Jericho's industrial past and the tour of the Chittenden Mills flour mill, Jericho's most notable mill building, now today being preserved by the Jericho Historical Society for future generations.